Hello everyone and welcome back to our series where we look at Auto 5s, the shotguns that the Auto 5 inspired or influenced it, and really the history of the automatic shotgun told through the lens of the long recoil action itself. Today we have something really rare. It looks just like an Auto 5, and that's not a mistake. It is a true Auto 5 in the original sense. It's an actual copy, a very dedicated clone of the Auto 5 that only differs in one or two ways. The catch with this gun, though, is that it was made by a manufacturer that you may not even be aware made clones of the Auto 5. Of course, we're aware of the American licensed production of Auto 5s by Remington and Savage, for example. We're also aware of Japanese unlicensed production of the Auto 5, like the Yamamoto Pointer and a couple examples that we'll look at later. But the maker of this gun was actually Franchi, the same Franchi that would later make the 48 and the 48AL shotguns. Now, to set the stage for the history, there in post-World War II Italy, there was a serious economic downturn in sort of manufacturing difficulties that were going on across the country. Trouble getting raw materials, trouble getting talented people into jobs where they could then try and rebuild their country in the aftermath of the war. Franchi, as a shotgun manufacturer, had existed in some state before the war and then had helped out during wartime production. But post-war, they, like many other Italian shotgun companies, turned their attention towards an automatic shotgun that they could have some amount of export success with. While most other companies looked at a way to make the Auto 5 better, improve some of the real or imagined issues that people had found with the gun, Franchi took an alternative approach. They just wanted to copy the Auto 5 as close to one as they could. And while a few changes were made, the advertising for this gun included a parts list for it, with the list of which parts were intended to be one-to-one directly compatible with the FN manufactured Browning shotguns. Now, it's important to remember that at this time, FN was no longer making Auto 5s because, they had been occupied by the Nazis and the Nazis raided the FN factory, and so FN wasn't quite back in the position where it could make Auto 5s, but they still owned and planned to fiercely protect intellectual property relating to the Auto 5. Now, by the time the Franchi 48 came out, the patents wouldn't actually have been an issue. However, FN still had a vested interest in the trademark or trade dress appearance of the Auto 5. The way the Auto 5 looks and calling it Auto or Auto 5 or Automatic was something that FN would succeed against Yamamoto with the Yamamoto Pointer Auto, where they had to drop Auto from the name because the gun looked so similar to FN's Auto 5. Now, while Franchi never had an official name for this gun besides just the Franchi Automatic or the Franchi Automatic 5, it sort of took on the name as the Type Auto 5, and it was this nomenclature that ended up getting Franchi in trouble with FN. FN would sue Franchi as soon as they found out that this shotgun was going on, and while they'd been unable to sort of find the disposition of the court proceedings, Franchi stopped making this gun, waited a year, and then eventually started making the Franchi 48 instead. So it's probably fair to say that FN reached some sort of a settlement with Franchi that would involve Franchi not making any more of the clones of the Auto 5. All told, a little under 1,000 of these Franchis were ever made, and of course they didn't have the opportunity to sell well, and had they been available on the market for a longer period of time, I think people would have quickly noticed that it's really just an Auto 5 that's rougher in fit and finish and quality. Certainly spinning up production quickly to clone a gun as complex to manufacture as the Auto 5 is going to have problems, and as we take this gun apart and sort of look at its internals, we'll take note of one or two small places where there's just a little rough fitment or evidence of hand fitting taking place in the gun, where on a Belgian gun, they sort of had things figured out a little better such that they could avoid that. Now, a couple of things to note as we go around the exterior of the gun. We have a slightly different shaped charging handle on this gun, and I've had the opportunity to inspect one of these guns that was made about 100 guns later sequentially in serial number, and it had a Franchi 48 shaped charging handle. This charging handle is sort of a blend between the Franchi and the Auto 5, and what this really suggests to me is that this was never meant by Franchi to be something they stayed in production with a long time, because even in that less than 1 year, 1,000 gun production run, they were changing the design and changing the shape of some parts as they were trying to mature it and improve on what they saw as weaknesses of the Auto 5 design. Certainly the stubby little charging handle on the Auto 5 is something some people complain of. The very early Auto 5s had a much more substantial, easier to grab on charging handle that shrunk as the production went on, and Franchi certainly has a very small version of that charging handle here. The 48's charging handle isn't a lot bigger, but it sticks out slightly further and is a little bit more spoon-shaped and a little bit easier to just hook one finger on and use to operate the bolt. Looking at the barrel, I've never seen one of these that didn't have a rib. I believe the rib to be standard. On this particular example, the rib has come just a little bit unsoldered about halfway along, so eventually I'll need to be repairing that. but otherwise this example is in fantastic shape. I originally thought this receiver and the barrel may have been refinished, owing to that the Italian proof marks are relatively lightly stamped, but I've since seen two examples of this gun which were not refinished, that were in sort of grungy looking shape, and the stampings were similarly light, and I have since also seen pictures of a museum grade example, right, sort of perfect condition, where the markings are again extremely light, and I have been assured that that gun has not been restored or altered in any way. So it seems that this was the finish the guns had, and frankly, it's really, really good looking. For a gun that sort of came out of nowhere and went away just about as quickly as it showed up, the finish that's actually put into the metalwork is pretty darn good. And this is about what we would expect from Franchi. Maybe in the post-war era that's a little bit surprising, but Franchi had sort of made a name for themselves in making pretty darn good shotguns prior to that, with this being their first automatic. And they certainly brought over quite a bit of their craftsmanship here. Now, we have a straight stock. This was an option on Auto 5s, of course. This was the way that Browning had originally designed the gun, though on the American market, the straight stock would be much more uncommon, the straight stock being more of a British or a European favored thing, but these Franchis would opt to copy that and have that straight grip. Other external observations involve the presence of 3 extra screws, one there, and one here. These screws are responsible for holding in the pins on the bottom of the gun for our shell stop bolt release, our barrel forward position indicator latch toggle, as well as our magazine cutoff, which is certainly something that FN wouldn't have liked for Franchi to have been doing, because the US licensed manufacturer version of these guns didn't end up licensing production of the guns with the magazine cutoff. So Franchi coming and knocking that off really would have angered FN, because this was sort of the thing that set the FN manufactured guns apart at this point in time. In this regard, this gun really and truly is a straight-up, unabashed copy of the Auto 5. It was very clear what they were trying to do. We have the front of the trigger guard, sliding style safety, only the tooth on the front of the safety in order to be able to engage it is slightly different profile, and the thing has a little bit more excess movement than we're used to seeing on FN manufactured examples, but the controls are still positive and they work the way they're supposed to, where if we cock the hammer back and then put the safety on, the trigger will not release the hammer, kick the safety off, and the trigger will. As far as the trigger pull goes, it's a little bit more mushy and a little bit less positive than we're used to feeling on an Auto 5. Part of this owes to the fact that the trigger return spring is substantially heavier on this gun than I felt on any Auto 5. It's really quite stiff in comparison. And paired with the fact that I'm sure the sear surfaces aren't quite as sharp as we're used to seeing on Brownings, the trigger pull just isn't very good. It sort of has like a set or a fit to it right at the very beginning, and then it goes off. So the thing certainly isn't getting any marks for good trigger pull feel, but again, this was a very quickly spun up, very hastily manufactured, but still pretty darn good clone of the Auto 5. That's pretty much it for external observations. Of course, this butt pad was not original. At some point along the way, somebody's put a rubber butt pad on this gun. The original butt pad for these guns just sort of had the Franchi banner on it, very similar to the original Franchi 48 butt pads. But with all that discussion aside, I guess the last thing that we can note as far as handling it here is that the handguard doesn't fit the gun particularly well. It wobbles around a little bit at the receiver. You'll find this with some FNs, especially on ones that have had the forend replaced. So ones that had had a cracked forend that then got replaced very quickly or very hastily. If they're not fit to the gun, they can wobble around left and right. As far as I can tell, this is the original forend. The profile on it is slightly different than an actual Auto 5 forend profile. So at the very least, this is one that is supposed to be on this Franchi clone of the Auto 5. It's frustrating that the wood's not just a one-to-one match, because this one does have a very slim hairline crack that doesn't look to me like it's from shooting the gun. It looks to me like it was from handling the handguard whenever it was off the gun, right? The crack up here or even higher is usually from someone pinching or dropping the handguard whenever it's removed. So we'll just have to do our best to be careful with it as we go to disassemble the gun. Disassembly is just like an Auto 5 because, of course, we've got a clone here. We've got our magazine cap, which will come off there. We have our forend, which, as mentioned, fits a little funky. It's tight up at the front. Get it removed. And then our barrel will come off. And we can see a couple of interesting things here. First is that many of the major pieces of this gun are marked L. Franchi, Luigi Franchi. I guess to differentiate them, I'll try and point it out everywhere that I see the mark as we go, but it's in a lot of places on the gun, so I'm sure I'll end up missing some. Besides that, our barrel is fairly familiar. As I mentioned, the ribs sort of coming off there in the middle. We have a soldered on barrel hanger. It's nothing really too surprising there because making a specific forging and then machining setup for the integral barrels is pretty darn difficult. And it would really suck to do on something that's like low rate production, that like invest in all that tooling and then get told by FN that you can't do that. Would be very unfortunate. Looking further back, we have a barrel extension, which really is a very honest-to-goodness clone of the Browning barrel extension. There's very, very little difference here. This is all really true to the original Auto 5 design. The only bit of forward-looking to the Franchi 48 I've seen in any of these guns is in, as I mentioned, that later serial number gun had that Franchi 48 style charging handle. And that wasn't because they put a Franchi 48 charging handle on the gun, because these charging handles, how they interact with the bolt is just like on a Browning. On a Franchi, that's somewhat different. So that charging handle definitely belonged on that gun. It just seems that they changed the profile of the charging handle ever so slightly there in the short production run of these guns. But that's about it that we have as far as remarks about the barrel. I guess it's matted on top of the rib, but nothing really fantastic or revolutionary going on there. We can set that to the side for now. Next thing we'll look at here will be the handguard. As I mentioned, it's slightly different in profile compared to a regular Browning. However, they are interchangeable. So you can put an Auto 5 regular forend on here. And in fact, I'll probably end up swapping this one out with a printed one at some point just to preserve it. Because, as mentioned, it does have a slight hairline crack there that's already formed. And I don't want that to end up spreading too far. As far as the handguard itself goes, we can note that we have the ring like the Brownings. We don't have the pegs like the Remingtons. I really like the Remington pegs on the forend because that sort of prevents them having that wobble left and right that this gun exhibits and some Brownings exhibit. We have a little elm insert like the Auto 5s would end up adding to sort of prevent, so if this ring starts cracking, it prevents it from cracking all the way forward. It can only crack as far forward as that reinforcement. That's certainly a nice touch. It's certainly something good to have. But otherwise, this forend is relatively plain. We can see a little bit of wood compression going on here at the front. There's a little bit of wood compression present there at the front of the handguard, and it doesn't have that little plastic compression ring that we'd see on the Franchi 48s shortly after they entered production. And really the only other big difference about the handguard is that much like the 48, it has this ever so slight curvature to it, where it curves out and then tapers in at the front a little bit further than the Brownings do. A very, very slight difference, but I suppose if you've got a very well-calibrated eye, you could use this to tell these guns apart from actual Auto 5s. Taking a look at our friction system, we have our standard spring, pretty much standard control ring, and then pretty much just a clone of the Browning friction piece system. It does have little steps on the inside, but it's very hard to see. On the Brownings, the peaks and grooves on this ring are much more steep, much more pronounced than they are on the Franchi. On the Franchi, they're maybe 10, 15 thou deep. On the Brownings, it feels like they're about 5 to 10 times deeper than that. It's probably not actually that deep. It just seems much deeper than what you've got going on here. Additionally, here on this control ring, not dissimilar to the Winchester Model 40, it feels that this was made out of a material that wasn't quite hardened correctly. On the couple examples of these I've been able to inspect, this ring ends up getting peened or curled over such that it tries to dig into the magazine tube, or it just fails to lock correctly in the heavy load position against the friction ring. So I did have to do a little bit of buffing to remove that rolled over metal, and I will have to continue to keep an eye on it. If this ring continues to deform itself, I will have to swap in a Browning ring, which the parts list for this gun mentions is an approved fix. You can just put Browning parts right into this thing because it was made to be a clone. Looking now at the magazine tube, we can see that it's pretty much just like the Brownings. On two of the examples of these guns that I've been able to look at, the magazine tubes have both had a little bit of wobble. It does use the Browning style retention system, right, where the tube is threaded into the receiver very tight up against a step, and then a screw is drilled to sort of hold the tube from being able to unrotate. This, of course, differs from the Franchi 48 retention system, which has the tube thread into the receiver, again, tight, but then it sort of has like a key that locks the tube from being able to rotate, and that key can be taken in and out. This, of course, has the clone of the Browning system. As I got this gun, the lock screw to hold the magazine from rotating didn't actually engage with the magazine properly. It was just barely long enough that it hardly touched the threads on the magazine tube, so you could loosen and then tighten the magazine tube with the screw installed. And the big problem there was if the magazine cap was installed extra tight, you'd just start threading the whole mag tube out. And you really would like to avoid that if you can, because of course this screw is still long enough that it will touch the threads, and so you'll just booger up all the threads on your mag tube. So I did have to put a replacement screw in this gun in order to fix that. It seems like, at least with my sample size of 2 I've been able to inspect, both of them seemed to have this same issue. So it may have been a thing where these screws were just slightly too short on the reverse engineering drawings, or either the receiver was slightly too thick or the spring for the magazine cutoff was slightly too thick to just barely prevent the screw from engaging enough to prevent rotation of the mag tube. So I guess if you guys end up with one of these guns and have that issue, you can just use a Browning screw in here. You'll just have to make sure that it interfaces correctly with the tube. But with that said, that gets us sort of to our action disassembly. Further disassembly is identical to the Auto 5, which means that we're going to need to break out the trusty screwdriver set, because it wouldn't be a Browning design if it wasn't completely coated in screws. Starting right off, we have 2 screws to get the buttstock off here. Of course, again as a reminder, on Auto 5 maintenance, you never take this screw out, because this screw is responsible for tensioning parts inside of your trigger group. If you remove this screw, you can sometimes get that spring to wedge itself such the gun becomes very, very difficult to reassemble. So leave that screw alone. The screws that we're after are this lock screw and then the screw behind it. And with the correct fitting screwdriver selected, of course, again, right, these are hollow ground screws. We say it every time because it's worth repeating. Anytime that you're dealing with guns and you can see that the screws are hollow ground, right, that the slot and the screws is parallel and not tapered out, use parallel tip screwdrivers. Using the correct screwdriver is very important to avoid damaging screws and also to prevent the screws from becoming stuck. So it's worth paying attention and doing things right. We have a short little screw there, and then once it's removed, we will be able to take the buttstock off. If I remember correctly, the stock on this gun is quite tight, so I'm going to do the Auto 5 stock removal trick. I won't be able to show it very well to the camera, but for those that don't know, it involves having one hand grab about here on the wrist of the stock and pull down while you tap the receiver heel against a rubber mat on the edge of the table. So something like this. And that will get the stock to come right off without risking breaking anything. There we have our stock. Again, it's straight. It's a little bit heavier than we're used to feeling with Brownings. And of course, I won't take the recoil pad off again because it's annoying to have to do, but there's not as much wood routed out of the back of the stock here as there is on Auto 5s, so the stock just has a little bit more weight than it would have. Not dissimilar really to the early Auto 5s, but by the time, right, these guns were made 1945, 1946. By that point in time, the Auto 5s did have that extra wood removed and they had lighter stocks. The very, very early Auto 5s, like 1910s production, had slightly heavier stocks because they had a little bit more material left behind. But I guess Franchi cloned that, although I'm not sure if they cloned it so much as removing excess material from the stock just wasn't worth it to them. With that step out of the way, we are ready to lower the bolt forwards gently. Of course, you never want to let it slam on these guns if you can at all avoid it. And with that lowered, we can then remove the action plug with a little punch. This is just like on a Browning, and in fact, it just fell out right for me. And like on the Brownings, the early Brownings anyway, this is made out of wood. It's very funny to see that. This is some ancient oil-soaked piece of wood. And then our action spring and plug will slide nicely out of the gun. Set those to the side because they are just like we're used to seeing on an Auto 5, right? There's nothing new going on there. At this point, we are ready to remove the trigger guard from the gun, which is 4 screws on the other side. Now, these 4 screws are these 4, 2 lock screws, 2 primary screws. Get our screwdriver that's right for the lock screws and then pop them out. And now switch screwdrivers. I believe this one's going to be too wide for that screw, but I bet it's just right for this one. Yep. There's 1 screw, and of course the carrier is sprung, so it's going to spring the trigger guard down as we're doing this. See if maybe this screwdriver bit will get it. It's a little bit of a rough fit, but because these screws have lock screws, the screws themselves are not very tight. That's about all that the screw has threads. Go ahead and pull it out there, set it to the side, and now our trigger group will spring off. And then our carrier spring will come out too, because like the Brownings of the time, the carrier spring was mounted to the receiver instead of being mounted to the trigger group. Later Brownings would mount the carrier spring there on the trigger group, but this Franchi and the earlier Brownings just had a peg pressed into the receiver that mounted the carrier spring. So that's how that there works. We will see more inside the action here in a moment, but for now I just want to show off our trigger group. We have an L Franchi marked hammer there. And it's really just like an Auto 5. They even went so far as to copy the out-of-battery safety from the Auto 5. So we have that there. But everything in here just feels a little bit more rough. There's more slop and wiggle in the hammer to the trigger group. The trigger has a little bit of side-to-side play that doesn't exist on most Brownings. The out-of-battery safety feels crunchy as it rotates, like its spring doesn't quite fit right in its hole. Everything here is just a little bit more rough around the edges, because as we've explained, right, this is sort of just a rough around the edges sort of clone. But the trigger group is that Browning double hook design that we know so well by now. And of course the hammer is slotted. For those that don't know, right, the reason that there is a solid fire control group on the Auto 5, and despite it being a 12 gauge long recoil gun, the reason it only has a little bit of trigger slap is because the hammer is actually slotted so that it can float up and down, and this is how disconnect is achieved. So whenever the hammer is getting cocked back after the trigger has been pulled, the hammer will come and hit on the disconnecting hook, but the hammer itself will actually slide forward as it sort of pushes the trigger backwards. So it's a very interesting system, right, that the hammer has a little bit of float there as it's being pushed by this flat spring. And remember, this flat spring is that screw that I say never to remove, because if you remove it just wrong, the spring can pop up and then lock pieces of the gun in place to prevent disassembly. It's a very awkward mess. So anyway, all that rambling aside, there's our trigger group. It's a clone of an Auto 5 trigger group. There's really not a ton to see. Maybe one note that we could make is there's a little bit of deformation on the strike face of the hammer. Certainly evidence of material hardness, material properties specs not being 100% of the way there, which makes sense, right? This is something that we would expect of a gun that, again, right, it had one total year of production. It didn't have a very long time to figure stuff out. So a little bit of wear in strange places, and at least, you know, haven't inspected these sear surfaces with a jeweler's loop. But in fact, we don't actually have to. I think I've found where the fit in the trigger is that the hammer, the primary sear hook there on the hammer is scraping on the trigger until the trigger is pulled slightly, and there's your fit. That the hammer doesn't want to ride up the trigger properly. I'm going to try putting a little dab of grease on there just in case, but probably it's just a thing where either the hook on the hammer or the hook on the trigger is just shaped slightly wrong because the thing was reverse engineered. Alright, with a little bit of grease applied, we'll at least check and see if that changed anything about the way that the hammer and trigger fit together. It didn't, right? It still has that fit where starting to pull the trigger, there it's on the primary sear, here it's just sort of hung up. That's a little bit of a funky thing there, but clone of the Auto 5 trigger group. It's just not made very well. Put that to the side. Then we now return our attention to the action. We can, at this point, get the carrier out. Switching back to our lock screw remover, we have one lock screw on either side, would you believe it? Just like an Auto 5. We have lock screw number 1 there, and this is the right side lock screw, so I'm going to put it over there so that we don't mix them up. It's not necessarily fit, right? The lock screws can go back into either position, but at least on FN Auto 5s as they leave the factory, the lock screws will be cut so that their screw head slot is going the same direction as the screw that they're retaining. I have tried all of the combinations on this Franchi. I don't think the Franchi was made that way, but this one does line up correctly. So this one may have just come out that way on accident, but I do like to keep it there just in case. It was certainly it's a very over-the-top thing that FN elected to do in trying to fit screw slots to line up as perfectly as possible. Right, like lock screw slots have to face the same direction. There's zero mechanical benefit to that. It's just done to make the gun look a little better. This is the left side screw, so we will put it on the left. And the right side screw we will put on the right. Alright, and at this point the carrier will come out of the gun, although it fits a little bit tighter than I've seen on a lot of Brownings. So it takes a little bit of wiggling. There we go. And we have El Franchi marked there on the carrier. And it's also marked here on the carrier dog, though it's a little hard to see because the dog's dirty. It's a dirty dog and it's all oiled up. But you have more El Franchi marks going on inside of there. Moving forward with this assembly, we have a couple of pieces and bits that we need to get out of our way. I will not take the lock screws for the pins out of the gun, simply because that takes too much time, and it's not something that you ever really need to be doing on your gun, even whenever the guns get very dirty, right, and they get dirty underneath these components on Auto 5s. You really don't ever get the gun quite dirty enough that it ends up causing a problem, but for very extreme circumstances. And on Auto 5s, those are, these pins are either screws in Auto 5s or roll pins that just get punched through. On some guns, like of course this Franchi or the Savage 775s and 755s, they have these lock screws that just hold solid pins. This is a little bit ugly and it adds a bunch of screws to the gun. However, it guarantees that these pins don't get stuck from being too tight. Because on the Brownings, the screws and the pins can get so tight in there that they end up not being able to be removed. So I don't hate this system of doing it, just as a side note. But for those that are curious, right, all that this button, all that this lever on the side of the gun does is whenever it's depressed, which is the case whenever the carrier has come up, it acts as a shell stop. So it stops the gun from putting a shell out of the magazine whenever the carrier is in the raised position. Whenever the carrier comes back down, this is sprung to hold the carrier down, and this is really what's responsible for holding the carrier in place. However, as a next round is fed, that round will come out of the magazine and then push this latch out of the way. So a shell coming out of the magazine is actually what's responsible for pushing this button in each time that the gun is ready to cycle another round. And that's how it knows to lock open, actually, is that there won't be a shell coming out of the magazine, and so the carrier will get locked down by this, and the bolt will get locked on the carrier, and then nothing will happen. So this is sort of your bolt hold open trigger, as well as your bolt release, as well as your responsible for keeping the, it's a shell stop, as well as it's responsible for keeping the carrier down. So it's a lot of pieces, it's one piece doing a lot of different things. And that's one of my favorite things about these shotguns, is that you'll have very multifunctional pieces in a way that rifles don't necessarily get to see, because of the way that shell tendering in a shotgun gets very complex very quickly. On the other side of the gun, we have this latch, which is this guy here. Really what this is it's responsible for the timing of the gun. So whenever the barrel comes forward, it will push this latch over. Whenever this latch is pushed over and there is a shell that has depressed the lever on the other side of the gun, it is capable of letting the carrier come up, and then once the carrier is capable of coming up, it will send the bolt home. So really this button is responsible for the timing of the barrel coming forward relative to the start of the feeding cycle, relative to the start of the bolt release stroke. So it's, again, a very multifunctional piece. And then the other pin there is just holding in the toggle for the magazine cutoff itself. So because these pieces don't always come out of an Auto 5, people get a little confused about what they do, but their jobs are relatively mundane. If you have an Auto 5 that has weird cycling problem, like it tries to kick out 2 shells every time, normally it's this guy on this side of the gun. Their springs can break or become damaged and will need to be inspected. If you have guns that hang up on feeding, like it just kicks the shell partway out, sometimes that can be a fault of this latch on the other side of the gun as the barrel comes forward. But in general, these two pieces don't have a lot of things that go wrong with them, and they usually aren't to blame. And with all that said, we are ready to get our bolt out of the gun. And it disassembles just like a regular Browning with that horrible taper pin system. And so we're going to have to get that taper pin aligned with this hole here, then flip the bolt group over, and then pass a small diameter punch into this hole and tap that pin out. On some guns, this pin would be unbelievably tight, like especially FNs, right? The taper to the taper pin is really stinking tapered. On this Franchi, though, it is not too bad. I can get it out with just light taps. There have been FNs that I have taken apart where I was the first person to ever take them apart, and it was like I was bending a good solid Starrett punch with a great big hammer with a tight fit in the hole. It's not because I was doing something wrong to bend it. And to validate myself, I then went and had to take the receiver on a press on a little 3D printed tool and had to use the press to press it out. And the press, didn't, of course the press didn't buckle, right? But the press bound up a little, indicating it was probably at least a ton of force needed to get that pin out of the gun. Needless to say, I polished that taper pin down just a little bit so that it doesn't have to be so ridiculously tight. But with that pin knocked most of the way loose, we just need a tool to tap it out the rest of the way. Once you've got it this far, the locking block latch there on the bottom of the bolt is spring loaded and it will sort of catch the pin. So we're going to set the pin to the side and then withdraw our tool, and the locking block latch will come free from the gun. We'll set it there with its pin, and then there is also a spring associated with it. So there's the spring for our locking block latch. With the locking block latch removed, we can pull the carrier tail up, pull the charging handle back, and then pass the bolt forward to get the bolt out of the gun. followed by the charging handle out of the gun. And at this point, we have what is effectively a stripped receiver, right? Disassembly of the receiver further than this is only needed on very rare occasion, right? As I explained, with the side pins and then also with the mag tube. It's not something that's meant to be removed to be serviced. So this really is a stripped Franchi automatic Auto 5 clone thing. With all of that out of the way, we can take our receiver to the side. Set it there for now since we're really done taking pieces out of it. And we can see that our charging handle has an L Franchi mark there on the bottom. And it really is a interchangeable part clone of the Auto 5's charging handle. It just has a slightly different handle shape on it, which is a very interesting thing, right? It's just an ever so slightly different charging handle shape. Put that there. On the bolt group itself, we see another L Franchi there for the carrier tail. One interesting thing about this gun is that it adopted the Remington-style pin for retaining the firing pin, where the charging handle is on the gun, this pin is incapable of falling out. But once the charging handle is off the gun, that pin can be easily removed. On the Browning, it's an awful taper pin that, again, can be way too tight. And then this lets us get our firing pin out of the gun. Once again, we'll see a L Franchi mark, and with the firing pin out of the gun, the locking block itself can come up and out of the bolt. However, the locking blocks on the guns that I've had the chance to disassemble are very stiff, and I don't think this is because tolerances were machined very tightly. I think it's because the block actually causes a little bit of damage, a little bit of peening and wear on its little slot that it rides in on the side of the bolt, and then it binds up just slightly. Of course, you can see a lot of grinder marks, and while these marks are flat enough that I think this was done with a tool, I don't think that this was done with a very advanced or complex tool, because you have grinder marks going every direction. You have some that are swooped like this, and some that are going out this way on a much bigger radius tool, so there was several different tools that ground on this block to sort of get it to the point that it fits into the bolt group. But that's pretty much the core mechanism of the gun here, right? This is where our lockup is achieved, and it's got grinder marks on it, but it does lock up and it does function correctly. It's just a little bit stiff. On our bolt grip itself, we do have the FN, right, the Browning style double extractor system, a weaker extractor on this side just to sort of control the location on the case head of the bolt, and then our strong side extractor here that's really responsible for getting the case flicked out of the gun. Other than that, we have what's really a parts interchangeable bolt group. Other than that, while this is L Franchi marked, it could just be a Browning interchangeable bolt group. The dimensions I've checked on it seems fine. You can take parts from one bolt group to the other, and they have a little bit of weird fitment quirks, but it's certainly evident that what Franchi was doing was reverse engineering the FN gun. With all this said, we now have effectively a completely stripped Auto 5, right? It's solid pins to get the extractors out, but I don't like doing that unless I have to because it's annoying to have to fight the springs. There's a few pins that are meant to sort of be semi-permanent installs, right, to get the locking block apart or to get the dog off of the carrier. And while the fire control group on the Auto 5 really isn't that bad to strip down, it's just a pin there, and you feel that you have to remove the out-of-battery safety, it's another pin there, but it's not really something that's meant to be removed a ton, right? It's meant to be sort of a semi or quasi-permanent install because that pin has to sort of be a press tight fit into the trigger group, and the more you take it in and out, the quicker that's going to end up wearing away. But really, nothing here is that unique because it is such a dedicated clone of the Auto 5. I know some people may be lost, right? They may not see the point where it's just like, well, it's just an Auto 5 clone, isn't it? So what? I just think it's interesting that Franchi cuts their teeth on automatic shotguns with this. FN tells them to knock it off. They pause for about a year and then come out with the Franchi 48, and that's a really quick turnaround. And sure, right, we have evidence because of the higher serial number one of these guns that, at least with the charging handle shape, they had that much of a head start on getting to the Franchi 48, but it's just really impressive to me the ingenuity that's on display here, that, sure, copying a gun is lazy, but they did do a pretty decent job of it. Yeah, there's a little bit of rough fitment here and there. There's grinder marks where there probably shouldn't need to be grinder marks. There's a little bit of like weird heat treat stuff going on steel on some impact points. But it's really impressive to have a relatively high finish, maybe not so high quality fit Auto 5 clone, a well and true and proper clone of the gun that comes out right there after the war. I may be the only person that would sit here and geek out about that sort of thing, but it's really cool, and I'm really happy to be able to show this gun off to you guys. At this point, I'll go ahead and get the thing reassembled. We'll do a couple of closing thoughts. I'll end up doing a separate shooting segment on this gun just because, it's really an Auto 5, and in terms of shooting it, it's just an Auto 5 that's slightly rougher around the edges. However, I do plan on taking this gun pheasant hunting, and I'd like to get footage recorded of that, and I'm not sure how I'll exactly wrap that into a video. Of course, I guess you guys could tell me in the comments if you're interested in seeing pheasant hunting video somehow tied into an explanation of how I felt the gun did at it. Certainly let me know that, but I would like to bring a couple of weird shotguns that are sort of rare or uncommon and then stretch their legs doing something practical, something real beyond just shooting clay birds with them. So if you guys are interested in that, you can certainly drop me a comment and then say you'd be interested in it. At the very least, I think I might mix in some of that footage as B-roll, but if you guys are interested in something that's more like a practical hunting breakdown of how practical is it to hunt with a Browning double auto, or how practical is it to hunt with a Cosme, or how practical is it to hunt with a heel grind inertial or something like that, right? I could certainly make those videos if you guys would be interested in watching them. But with all that said, let's fast forward through the reassembly, because the reassembly on these guns is pretty much just the reverse of disassembly. The one thing to pay attention to is which side of the taper pin is the small end and which is the big end. But we'll get the thing thrown together and do a quick couple of closing thoughts.
Delle belle turbando a riposo, narcisetto a dolcino d'amor. Delle belle turbando a riposo, narcisetto a dolcino d'amor. Fra guerrieri può far bacco, grande stacchi stretto sacco.
All right, and there we have our Franchi automatic Franchi Tipo A5 reassembled. There isn't a ton to say about this thing that can't really just be a repetition of what's said about the Auto 5. I guess the unique things about this one is that the size of the stock at the wrist is slightly smaller than you'd have on a 12 gauge Auto 5, so you have a slightly more petite grip here. You have slightly more curvature out to the forend. The forend wobbles just a little bit. The trigger has a little bit of fits, and this barrel is a little shorter than you'd see on a typical Auto 5 from around this time. The culmination of all of these factors is it's an Auto 5, I guess. And one that I personally have the big anxiety about, where, of course, if you shoot this thing enough that you break a part in it and it's one of the Franchi marked parts, well, you're not going to be getting another one of those unless you use a laser to fake the Franchi marks, I guess. But this isn't really the sort of gun that is intended to be something where you buy it to shoot it, because it's just a clone of the Auto 5. And the real value in something like this is its historical oddity. If you're a person like me that's very deeply interested in the long recoil guns and their history, of course the appeal to this sort of thing is going to be undeniable, right? It's really a red-headed stepchild that wasn't meant to exist and went away just as soon as it showed up. And most of this thing's value comes from there, because otherwise, quality-wise, it's maybe a step above the Yamamoto pointer, but not much of a step above. And it certainly got more rough feeling pieces to it than even the Remington Model 11s or the Savage 720s. And so the nicest thing that you can really say about a gun like this becomes, well, it's neat that it exists, but otherwise it's just a little bit more rough around the edges. Shooting it feels like an Auto 5, right? It carries most of the shooting feeling across, except for the trigger pull, as we explained, is a little bit worse on this one, but otherwise it feels just like an Auto 5 to shoot. It does have the early one-piece carrier, right? So the button has to be depressed at all times in order to load it. So hold the button in and go 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you can of course have one in the chamber in addition to that, but that's really all there is to it. As mentioned, we'll end up having a shooting segment on it eventually, and then maybe some amount of hunting footage with it eventually. Just thrown up into the shoulder here for sort of a check at the desk. It feels very, very similar to an Auto 5. As I mentioned, the actual diameter of the pistol grip feels smaller than you'll see on a straight stocked Browning. But I'm sure if you actually went to measure that, it would be an only barely slightly perceptible difference. I think most of that may just be in that the wood isn't maybe quite as round up at the receiver. It's just a very, very minor difference in stock fit. But otherwise, the stock dimensions feel pretty darn close to the cookie cutter stuff that FN was doing at the time, where the gun fits me pretty darn well. The comb could use to be a little bit higher and then tilted down just a little bit more for my preferences, but it fits me just like Auto 5s tend to fit me, and that's not bad. I don't want the takeaway to be that this was some sort of a throwaway project by Franchi, or it was just a cash grab to knock off what they saw as the most popular shotgun. I think what they were trying to do was offer an Auto 5 up to Europe for the first time in some years, because as we mentioned, FN wasn't making Auto 5s at this point. I'm willing to believe that what Franchi was trying to do here was an earnest attempt to offer more automatic shotguns to the market, and it wasn't just like an underhanded, hey, let's make some money really quick and then, dump all interest in automatic shotguns. Because their development doesn't stop here. It carries on to the Franchi 48, and from the 48 to the 48 AL. And probably that's a little teaser for a video that we'll have at some point in the future, is I would like to get my hands on a very early, as early as possible, Franchi 48, because as I've recently learned to sort of correct something from my Franchi 48 video, the push-pin style trigger group removal that is featured on the Remington 1148, Remington was definitely first to do that. Franchi did not do that until later on with the 48. The early 48s did not use that same exact push-pin system that we know from the Remington. In fact, the early 48s were a steel receiver with a steel trigger group, and the trigger group even had like square lugs or wings on the side to help it dovetail into the receiver. It's a really interesting thing, and I hope that eventually I can get an example to sort of show that off, that Franchi's interest in automatic shotguns was not fleeting. It was not something they were like one and done. They were interested in making something better, and this was just their sort of first rough stepping stone. And it didn't go great for them, and these are not by any means the best guns, but they're not bad, and they do look pretty darn beautiful when they're in great condition. And then maybe the best takeaway to have from this video is some version of humble beginnings. Franchi started with cloning the Auto 5, and then by the end of things, in some way, right, they stayed in production longer than the Auto 5 with the 48, which is pretty impressive. But even more so than that, I think Franchi improved on the Auto 5 in several key ways with the 48, and again, we talked about it in the 48 AL video. We talked at pretty decent length about the improvements that that gun made to the original Auto 5 system, and it's cool that the humble beginnings were Franchi doing their best to copy the Auto 5, getting told, no, don't do that. And instead of succumbing to that challenge and just sticking with their over-unders and their side-by-sides, they rose to the occasion and said, okay, we'll make something better. Up yours, FN. And while they never ended up then eclipsing FN's sales once FN came back into production with the Auto 5, the Franchi 48 is still very cool, and I think that this is a fun piece of that history. Anyway, I will go ahead and let you guys go. If you are interested in this sort of video, or videos where we just talk about gun history, or printed gun videos, or any of the other stuff that we do on this channel, I've got a Patreon. You can support me there. The support is much appreciated. Helps me bring you guys more weird stuff more often. I'm deeply appreciative of everybody who can support me over there, and I do sort of rely on guys over there to help me pick which video ideas to prioritize, or to tell me if a video idea is good or worth pursuing, or anything like that. So if you guys are interested in supporting me, or if you want to help contribute to the video idea selection process, go ahead and head over there and support me. I would appreciate it. With that said, I will see you guys next time, where we'll be looking at something else.